I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, while fighting continues around the area of Pokrovsk, Ukraine claims yet another attack on crucial Russian infrastructure. This time, it is the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia to Crimea, that was hit with underwater explosives. Meanwhile, in Istanbul yesterday, the Russian and Ukrainian delegations continued to be at a deadlock, despite agreeing on an exchange of POWs.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 3rd of June. 3 years and 100 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, host of Battle Lines, our sister podcast, Venetia Rainey, and dialing in from Ukraine, associate defense editor Dom Nicholls and executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley. Before we turn to the news from the battlefield, I just wanted to note to our listeners that we had a problem with yesterday's episode, which meant a delay on some of the platforms, and for the podcast feed, an unfinished version of the podcast was published. We apologise for that. It's now been fixed, and yesterday's episode is the final one available on all platforms. Thank you for your understanding. Now, let's turn to the news from the battlefield. Roland, what do you have for us?
I would like to begin down in Crimea with something that's really a bit of a breaking story, because about 20 minutes before we came on air, the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, announced another of their jack-in-the-box surprise operations. This time, they have detonated a bomb on the bridge to Crimea, the Kerch Bridge. They say it's the third time it's been hit since the war began. I admit I haven't been counting, but they say in their statement that they put out on Telegram, I've just got it in front of me, that God loves the Trinity. And the SBUs are the third time struck the Kerch Bridge. They say it was an underwater explosion. They apparently managed to get a lot of explosives into supporting pillars below the waterline. They say they used around 1,100 kilograms of TNT equivalent. And the video they've posted with it is of a big, large explosion sending water up all over the place. Too early to say, quite honestly, what the condition of the bridge is. Presumably, if it's done that much damage to the infrastructure or to the supporting pillars, then it may not be in terribly good shape. Obviously follows on from their spectacular drone attack on Russian air bases over the weekend. And I think we can all, Venetia will be talking about this in a second, about the diplomatic side of things. But I don't think things like this happen by accident or coincidence. We have to bear in mind there are peace talks going on in Istanbul, or have been going on. And that's one reason why I would assume the Ukrainians are suddenly trotting out these projects that have taken, perhaps years, well, over a year and 18 months in the case of the airbase attacks, to plan. So that's Crimea. Moving on to the battlefield, I'll follow our traditional clockwise tour of the combat zone. So starting in the kind of most northerly 12 o'clock position of the ground operations or ground combat areas. The Russians say, and they said this morning, they've taken control of another village in the Sumy region. It's a place called Andriivka. Now, this is on this area in Sumy where the Russians have established a kind of 25 to 30 kilometer long front. It's roughly, 10 kilometers is maybe being a bit generous, but approaching 10 kilometers deep at its very deepest point. This is straight across the border from Kursk region, kind of pushing towards Sumy city, which is south of there. And Russia is attacking there in 3 prongs, roughly from east to west. The Ukraine Center for Defense Strategy confirmed separately today that Russia did gain 1.5 kilometers in the central prong of those 3 thrusts and entered the village of Alexeyevka, which is a neighboring village to Andriivka. So the Russians pushing forward in Sumy. This is also the area where Vladimir Putin has talked about creating a buffer zone. Also seems to be part of the Russian pressure campaign linked to peace talks. Separately, I was going to mention this actually when I got into the air war, but this isn't really an air attack, and it tells you how close the war is getting to Sumy city itself. There was a Russian artillery attack, multiple launch rocket system attack on the city of Sumy itself today. We're told it killed 3 people and injured 25. That's according to the local council and the health ministry. And President Zelensky condemned that strike on his social media. So moving down around along the front line, kind of southeast of there, Ukraine still has its tiny little bridgehead inside Kerch region. Russian forces have been counterattacking there. Russian military blogs say Ukraine has counterattacked the counterattacks. Bottom line is we don't think any land has changed hands. The Ukrainians remain lodged in that very small little sliver of Kursk region. North of Kharkiv, the Russians attacked towards Liptsy and near Vovchansk, but without making any apparent gains. In eastern Kharkiv region around Kupiansk, there the Russians are putting in a bit of a bigger effort. They've attempted to advance northeast of Kupiansk, notably, launching attacks near the villages of Friklova, Zapadnya. Those are north of Kupiansk. And then moving around that salient that Kupiansk is kind of in the middle of, and also further south of the salient. And you can see this is a battle there that's been going on for months. Are we getting into even a year now? The Russian plan is clearly to degrade that salient and to pressure it from outside, but progress obviously very, very slow. South of Kupiansk in Liman, there is a slightly more interesting development here. So over the past week, Russian forces have been trying to break through westward from this previously captured village of Novye, and they've been putting a thrust between 2 very small villages. The names are Rydkodub and Zilyona Dolina. Now, Deep State charts the progress on that, and I'm talking about in the kind of past 5 days. It's created a finger. It's less than 1 kilometre wide, but nearly 6 kilometres long. We've got geolocated footage putting Russian forces in Karpivka, right at the tip of that salient. The Centre for Defence Strategies also says the Russian forces have advanced about roughly 300 metres south of Zilyona Dolina, and that looks like an attempt to envelop the village from 2 sides. CDS's assessment that significantly complicates the situation for the Hortitsia operational strategic grouping in the area. That's the Ukrainian troops. Further south, Siversk salient, the easternmost territory still held by Ukraine. Russian forces over the past 24 hours put in attacks all along the north-south line marking the eastern side of that salient. Didn't take any ground. At Chasiv Yar, that hilltop Donetsk region town guarding the approaches to the main Ukrainian fortress bells at Kramatorsk and so on, Russian forces try to advance in Chasiv Yar into the north of the town with some very marginal advances. They've also attacked to the south of it. Further south near Toretsk, the Russians have made some gains near Toretsk, northwest of Toretsk really, in what looks like a developing attempt to flank that town. But we also have reports from both Russian and Ukrainian sources of Ukrainian counterattacks in that area. Some Russian bloggers saying that those are frustrating Russian progress there. And now we're on to Pokrovsk now, and this is really where the action is at the moment. Of all the places up and down the line, we haven't seen any firm change of territory in the past 24 hours that I can identify. But the absolute consensus from observers on all sides seems to be that this is still the most fiercely contested area or sector or theatre or whatever other word you want to use for the front. So intense fighting southwest and northeast of Pokrovsk. Russia's centre operational grouping command, this is according to the assessment from CDS, is attempting to turn its tactical breakthroughs into a favourable operational result. And to that end, the 8th and 51st Armies have committed troops to the breaking through north and northwest of a place called Vozdvijenko, which is actually to the east of Pokrovsk itself. And they've been slowed down by those Ukrainian counterattacks or semi-Ukrainian counterattacks that I mentioned earlier. The actual real threat here in that sector, according to the Centre for Defence Strategies, and they're usually pretty good, these guys, which is why I keep quoting them, got a good record, is that the most dangerous sector for the Ukrainians is actually on the southwestern side of the Pokrovsk salient. The Russians, again, they're not near Pokrovsk yet. They're not in Pokrovsk, but they're approaching, and they're clearly trying to turn these incremental gains, if they possibly can, into a greater breakthrough, which is what they've been trying for months and months and months with mixed success. They are also, ironically, I know I did just say This is the most fiercely contested area of the front. Everybody says, there's heavy fighting in Donetsk, but it's nothing compared to the area around Pokrovsk, so on and so forth. Ironically, we also have, despite that, reports that the intensity of fighting here is actually dropping off slightly. Still intense, but less intense perhaps than it was. This is from Viktor Chekhubov, the spokesman for the Ukrainian group of forces in that area. He said the Russians are using infantry and motorcycle groups to make creeping gradual advances, but he says Russian losses are down, by his estimate, from about 1,000 losses per week 4 months ago to about 700 per week now, basically because they're using fewer people in attacks. I just got to say that there are reports further west along the line through Zaporizhia region to the Dnipro. There are reports of reconnaissance and probing attacks. Got reports of the Ukrainians building in a counterattack around Velika Novosilka, but no major developments or changes of territory. So moving on to the air war, I've already reported that rocket attack on Sumy, 30 kilometers south of the Russian border. I'll just quote what President Zelensky said about that. The Russians launched a savage strike on Sumy, directly targeting the city and ordinary people with rocket artillery, a fully deliberate attack on civilians. That strike landed at about 9 o'clock local time this morning, 0600 GMT. Separately, Russian drones attacked the city of Chernihiv, kind of north of Kyiv, last night. 4 people injured, residential buildings damaged. There was a Russian overnight strike in the city of Odessa last night. At least 4 people injured. I think we're going to have some updates on that shortly. That hit residential buildings and also a warehouse, as far as I'm aware. And interesting development in the Russian-occupied zones of southern Ukraine. So Russian-installed officials in the occupied areas of Kherson and Zaporizhia said that at least 700,000 people were without power after Ukrainian drone attacks and shelling knocked out electricity substations. No immediate comment from Ukraine on this, but this appears to be one of the largest of its kind on Russian-held territory of the war. Yevgeny Belitsky, the Russian-installed governor of Zaporizhia, said more than 600,000 people in nearly 500 settlements had no electricity after Ukrainian shelling damaged high-voltage infrastructure in Kherson, which neighbours Zaporizhia to the west. They've got Vladimir Saldo, he's the Russian-installed governor there. He said debris from fallen drones damaged 2 electricity substations, left 100,000 residents without power. So that's how we get to the 700,000 figure. Importantly, the Russians say the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is all under control. Everything's under control, but difficult. Radiation levels are normal. The plant, which is running in shutdown mode, doesn't produce any power. It's just cooling itself. It's all kind of okay. That is, Adélie, pretty much the sum, if not the entire total, of the military updates.
Thank you, Roland. I think now we've got Francis and Dom dialing in from Ukraine. Guys, can you hear us?
Thanks very much. So we're currently, Roland there was talking about the attack on Odessa, and we're now able to say that that actually is where we are right now. And we are looking directly in front of us at the residential building that was hit in the middle of last night. Just to paint a scene for you, there's currently lots of glass scattered across the pavement, and several windows have been blown out in this huge Soviet-style apartment building. Looks like it's about 20 floors, something like that. I think the thing that strikes you most being here is the force in which these windows have been blown out by a Shahed drone which dropped by very near here. It didn't just shatter the windows and the glass immediately dropped. They've been blown out. And so there is glass all over the place here in front of the cars that are parked around. And we were here in the city last night, which this was a pretty standard attack. I think that's important to emphasize. There's nothing special about this, but just to paint a scene for you of what occurred. So in the middle of the night, we were woken up by the usual air raid siren sounding out over the city and from our phones. Because of the attacks, of course, that there'd been over the weekend, we immediately thought, right, we better go down to the shelter in our hotel, which we did. We had to go through the swimming pool and then into the basement below the swimming pool. It was rather cozy in there. And about 10 or 15 minutes later, we began hearing very, very loud anti-aircraft fire and machine gun fire as well. And of course, we are very, very near in the center of Odessa to the ports, which were the targets. And as we've spoken about on the podcast before, it's very common for people in Ukraine to have Telegram apps where they're able to follow in real time the attacks taken place. And that's exactly what we did too. So we were able to see where these drones were coming from, maps being shown exactly where they were located, and people were monitoring and saying, right, we think that they're heading for this port, for that part of the town. Then saying, right, people are currently trying to shoot them down. So we were monitoring it, and it only lasted about an hour. And then the air raid siren ended, and we were able to go back to our rooms and try and get some sleep. But it's quite an experience to hear this just sheer scale of what is, as I say, quite a regular attack. The walls were tremoring. And it's extremely loud for the residents here. And whilst not everybody does go down to the shelter, given the frequency of the attacks, I think something that struck me whilst we've been here in Odessa is when we were speaking to parents of some children, and they were saying that whilst they don't feel that they necessarily always need to go down to the shelters, even during bad attacks, and bear in mind that can be a luxury for people who are living in tall apartment buildings like the one we're looking at here, if they've got children, they feel compelled to go down. And given the frequency of those attacks, I think that is something that must be a transformative and impeding experience for many parents. So just to give you a window on just an average attack in Ukraine, I want to emphasize that is an average attack in this city. And we were with the Navy this morning, and Dom's going to talk more about that in a second. And they said to us it was just an everyday experience for them. So underscoring that. But as I say, there have been people who have been hospitalized due to the attacks at the location where we currently are dialing in from, and a warehouse burnt, and this building has obviously been extensively damaged. So an average attack, but not a minor one.
Well, hi, Adélie. So, yeah, I'm sitting here next to Francis, looking out at the scene. It's a normal suburban street. There's red and white tape now, taping off the area where there's glass all over the place, and there's still a lot of broken windows looking up, and that glass is going to come out sooner or later. But people are carrying on. There's some kids next to me here, some girls. I've got their bubble tea. Everyone's bloody addicted to bubble tea these days. They are here as well, so they're cutting about. They're sort of smiling and laughing and getting on with life. There's other people walking past. They're just looking up and pointing and talking to their companions as they walk along the street. But it's a normal street. I'm looking at a row of cars. There's a Toyota, there's a Kia. What's that? Another Toyota. There's a RAV4. There's a Ford Transit van. I mean, this is a normal. There's a Mercedes over there. It's all quite normal. People are walking along, looking up, but also carrying on their normal conversation. It is just another day. It was another day as well for the Navy. We visited the Navy earlier on. We went out on a coastal patrol vessel, so not a massive vessel, but it had a crew of 8, and it had two main tasks, basically to go and look for mines and also to act as air defence. It had a big Browning 50 cal on the front that was a remote weapon. So it had this big weapon at the front, but it was controlled from inside the ship itself with a thermal camera. A guy just sat back in there with a joystick, and I interviewed him, and I thought it was going to be really quite technical. I said, "How long did it take you to train on this system?" He said, "Well, about a week." I was like, "All right, and is it hard? Is it really tough? Do you have to kind of concentrate and read lots of books?" He went, "No, you just sort of wave the joystick. It's like playing a game." It's like, okay, man, that's actually probably a brilliant interview, although it's not quite what I was expecting. But it was a snapshot of this aspect of the war. So, of course, there's lots of aspects to this war. The fight for control of the Black Sea and the grain corridor so that Ukraine can survive economically. There was an absolute snapshot there. So we were out on this coastal patrol vessel. Like I say, 50 cal at the front, minigun and a 7.62 at the back, heavy machine gun at the back. And there was a row of about 5 or 6 big tankers we could see steaming along, probably going about 20, 25 knots. And those things, I mean, they're massive. And going at that speed, it was really quite daunting being fairly close to them. They were coming in to stock up with fuel and get out of there. At the same time, there was an air raid alert. As we pulled out of port, while we still had sort of data connectivity with all our phones started lit up, and the guys who were with the Navy guys, they had all their reports come chattering in, and this was a ballistic missile going for somewhere, probably one of the ports. So you had a ballistic missile somewhere in the air heading for one of the ports, whilst you got the grain vehicles going into the port to fill up and keep Ukraine economically active in this war, as we were out on a coastal patrol vessel looking for threats from the sky as well as mines down below. It was an absolute snapshot of all the things we've been talking about for the last 3 years. It all sort of on this aspect of the war. It just came to a head in one sort of gloriously terrifying hour that we were on this boat. This boat, by the way, that was gifted from Estonia, one of two that was gifted from Estonia last year. It was brand spankers. It was brand new last year. It was unlike any naval vessel I've ever really been on. I mean, they said, "Would you like guys like a coffee?" It's like, yeah, okay, great, that'd be nice. I was expecting some stodgy old granules of something that was created back in 1967 with some fairly tepid water. No, they've got a barista machine. So this is like, do you want a latte or a frappuccino? I was like, I'll just have a coffee, thanks. Francis said you'd like a strawberry twist with a cinnamon twirl latte with a kind of whatever it was. So we sat there in relative luxury as we were leaving port. They wanted us down below. They didn't want us actually up top whilst we were still in port with this ballistic missile threat. So we had to just sit downstairs and have a coffee. It was absolutely bizarre. But then we went out on the water for about an hour to chat to them and see what they were up to. But no, very interesting to see that vessel. Then came. Oh, we're actually talking about that. So Estonia gifted 2. Sweden's gifted 2 of these similar patrol vessels as well. France have gifted some. The US have gifted low double digits. I could never get an actual number out of the guys we were speaking to. Low double digits of island class sort of coastal vessels, and they were due to be given another 3 earlier this year, but those 3 were turned off by the Donald Trump administration, and the blokes that they had, the Ukrainian Navy had in the US training for these vessels, were all sent home. So that's something else for me to dig into. I did dig into that actually a little bit later with Dmitry Plesenchuk, who's the spokesperson for the Ukrainian naval forces, that's Navy and the Marines. I interviewed him on dry land a little bit later, and I asked him about that, and he dodged it. He said it's a political question, not for me as a military man. Like, fine, I'm not going to get anywhere further down that cul-de-sac. But interestingly, so I interviewed him, what time is it now? I interviewed him about 2.5 hours ago, when we hadn't heard of the Kerch Bridge attack. Maybe it hadn't happened by then, I'm not sure. Roland would know better than us what time it happened. But I asked him, one of my questions to him was, why is the Kerch Bridge still standing? And he just smiled. Now, maybe he smiled because it's a question he gets asked all the time, or I don't know. I mean, this operation that Roland described was the SBU, Ukraine's security service, so not the Navy. There's no reason why the Navy would have known about it, although I would have thought the head of the Navy would, and therefore his spokesman would also. Anyway, so he sort of smiled. I then referred to Sunday night's drone attack inside Russia against the long-range aviation. And I said, and you've got the Magura V5 that you've now modified, or the SBU modified, a seaborne drone that can fire, or has fired, AIM-9 Sidewinders and destroyed Russian helicopters and jets. I said, have you got any more surprises up your sleeve? And again, he just smiled and said something like, well, surprises will as surprises do, or yeah, there's always surprises, or something like that. Anyway, so I was just intrigued. I'm intrigued that now we hear the news that there's been a maritime strike on the Kerch Bridge. But that's us, sadly. Still outside this apartment block, there's a lot of people coming about in high-vis vests, taking notes, interviewing people. I guess that's sort of normal after a strike, but normal life carries on in Ukraine.
And just one thing that struck me when we were out on the boat, there was a moment where Don was talking to camera, droning on a bit, and then all of a sudden we heard this rather loud explosion. And clearly that had come from one of the ballistic missiles that had been fired. And we immediately sort of turned around to speak to one of the officers that was with us, and he just shrugged and said, "This is war." It's pretty nonplussed. But that's us, Adélie.
Thank you for this very detailed image of what life is like in Odessa. We particularly here liked the list of cars, Dom, and the coffee machine. But it's all very interesting. Thank you very much. And we look forward to having you back in the studios with us in London. Venetia, do you want to catch us up on what's happened in Istanbul yesterday for the diplomatic updates?
Yes. As Roland alluded to yesterday, we had a second round of direct peace talks in Istanbul. The 2 delegations reportedly entered the large conference in the Ottoman-era palace without exchanging handshakes or pleasantries. The Russians were led by Putin aide Vladimir Medinsky, and Ukraine's delegation was led by Defence Minister Rustem Umerov. The talks lasted less than 2 hours. And just a recap, Ukraine had been proposing a full ceasefire of at least 30 days. That would be followed by the return of all prisoners held by each side and of all the Ukrainian children that have been taken into into Russian-held territory, and that would be followed by a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Now, the Ukrainian officials have been waiting weeks for the Russian peace proposals to be published, but those documents were only made available just as the talks started in Istanbul, and they were happening while we were recording the podcast yesterday, so bringing you the full updates now. It was a really long memorandum from the Russians in the end, and it essentially resembles a complete capitulation for Ukraine. So I'm just going to outline what's in it. The document's first section contains Moscow's basic parameters of a final settlement, stipulates that Ukraine must withdraw all of its troops from the 4 eastern regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, despite Russia only partially occupying them, calls for international recognition of Russian sovereignty over those 4 regions, as well as Crimea, calls for curbs on the size of Ukraine's military, permanent neutrality and commitment to having no foreign troops on its territory, the resumption of Russian natural gas transiting through Ukraine, a ban on the glorification or promotion of Nazism and neo-Nazism, and for the Russian language to be given official status. The second section in the memorandum has the Kremlin's conditions for agreeing to that 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine and its Western partners have been pushing for. And it basically appears to give Kyiv 2 choices. Either Ukraine can withdraw its troops from those 4 regions claimed by Russia that I outlined above, or it can agree to a package of demands that includes cancelling martial law and holding elections. Among the other requirements is a total halt on all foreign military aid and for Ukraine to begin demobilising. Obviously, those are completely unrealistic demands, and I know David Blair is going to be digging more into that with a full analysis later after I've finished chatting. So let's just go over what did they actually agree. Well, an exchange of 6,000 bodies of fallen soldiers, as well as an all-for-all swap of any seriously wounded and injured prisoners of war and captured servicemen under 25. The Russians apparently offered a series of smaller, localised truces across the front line to allow for the collection of dead bodies, but this was rejected by Ukraine. A senior military figure told The Telegraph, and I'm quoting from Joe Barnes's reporting here, that Russia has previously used similar pauses to prepare for fresh assaults, so that was a no-go. One more thing to note from these talks. At one moment, Mr. Medinsky, who was leading the Russian delegation, criticised the Ukrainians for handing over a list of nearly 400 Ukrainian children that they want returned from Russia. He said, "Do not put on a show for European tender-hearted aunties who don't have children themselves." That's according to a quote shared with The Telegraph. Ukraine has documented nearly 20,000 cases of children being taken into Russian-held territory. But in this meeting, Russian negotiators said that it's more like hundreds. Zelensky's pointed to this to say that at least Russia finally admitted that they have taken children, even if they are quibbling over the number. And I know that's something that we've been reporting a lot on this podcast. So no resolution in those peace talks, unsurprisingly. That means all eyes are now on Trump. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has proposed that Putin, Zelensky, Trump and himself come together for a third round sometime later this month in either Istanbul or Ankara. Putin so far refused any such meeting. Zelensky said that he's willing. Trump has said that he's open to the idea, according to the White House, but he wants the leaders on both sides to come to the table together, whatever that means. There were no US representatives at yesterday's talk. Instead, we've got Zelensky's Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, and the First Deputy Prime Minister flying today to Washington. They're going to update figures in Trump's administration on the talks in person. They're also going to talk about more defence support, the situation on the battlefield, and crucially, strengthening sanctions against Russia. That's all according to Yermak, who posted on X earlier today. So on the subject of US sanctions, Zelensky said yesterday that he really wants Trump to take some strong steps and try and toughen sanctions on Russia to push it to agree to a full ceasefire. Trump has not come out in support of that yet. He wants to give the talks more time, but it does seem to be gathering a bit more support in the US. Yesterday, we had House Speaker Mike Johnson voicing his support for a Senate-backed bill. He said, "There's many members of Congress that want us to sanction Russia as strongly as we can, and I'm an advocate of that." This all comes after a bipartisan group of US senators said in late May that they're ready to vote on a bill of sanctions against Russia if the peace talks don't progress soon. This bill was introduced to Senate in early April, and just to recap, it would impose some new penalties on Russia, slap 500% tariffs on imports from countries that buy Russian oil, petroleum products, natural gas, or uranium. Finally, 2 more little stories to mention. So on the NATO summit, which, as we all know, is coming up later this month, Ukraine has been invited to the summit in The Hague, but Zelensky does not appear to be attending. Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha is going to be going instead. That puts an end to speculation that Ukraine would not be invited at all due to opposition from Trump's administration following what we know has been a very rocky few months. But There was also speculation about Zelensky attending. Obviously, at the previous NATO summit last year in Washington, he was a very prominent presence. There's been some reporting suggesting that this year's communique might avoid any direct mention of Russia or Ukraine. That would obviously be a big contrast to previous summits, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. It's just reporting at the moment. And then just finally, here in the UK, Rachel Reeves is reportedly preparing to sue Roman Abramovich. This is all about trying to break this 3-year deadlock around the frozen $2.35 billion that was brought up from the sale of Abramovich's former football club, Chelsea. He was sanctioned back in March 2022, shortly after the full-scale invasion, and he sold the club and said the proceeds would go to, and I'm quoting here, all Ukraine war victims. But the proceeds have since been frozen. They're in limbo, basically, in a UK bank account. And apparently that's due to a dispute between Abramovich and British government ministers over which war victims he's talking about. Obviously, the Labour government want that to go to Ukrainian war victims. So they're holding the same line as the previous Tory administration. They're trying to make sure, basically, that the money doesn't fall back into the hands of Russians. That's all for diplomatic updates from me. Back over to you, Adélie.
Thank you, Venetia. That was fascinating. And now we welcome back on the podcast David Blair. David, you're the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator at The Telegraph, to talk a bit more about the talks yesterday in Istanbul and especially Putin's peace terms. He's been making still maximum demands. Does that strike you as surprising when Ukraine's done a proper show of force over the last 48 hours, and again this morning with the Kerch Bridge? Do you think that came as a surprise to Putin, and do you think that was a way of maybe changing the narrative around these talks? And clearly it hasn't seemed to work.
Yes, hi Adélie. So the Putin peace terms, I don't think there's anything surprising about them. These are the maximum Russian demands, and they're pretty much identical to the demands that Russia's been making from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. I won't repeat all the terms because Venetia's just described them, but I'll just offer 3 observations. First of all, these are the kind of peace terms which you dictate to a puppet government which you've installed by force in a capital that you've conquered. It's almost as if the Russians are behaving as if they had overthrown Zelensky 3 years ago and that they were now dealing with some quisling Ukrainian government that they could just push around. It's extraordinary that they're still making these kinds of demands because they must know they're completely unacceptable and won't go anywhere. The second point is, what strikes me most of all, really, is the complete failure of America's efforts to bring the two sides closer together. You know, what became of all those meetings between Steve Witkoff and Putin in Moscow, and all the various contacts between the US administration and their Russian counterparts? You know, at the end of all that, we have a list of Russian demands which are exactly the same as those that they put forward 3 years ago. You know, all that American diplomacy hasn't shifted the Russians an inch. And the third thing I'd just say is there's a wonderful irony here, which is that back on March the 11th, as you'll remember, the Ukrainians said yes to a ceasefire and Putin did not. His rejection of that ceasefire turned out to be a very costly decision because it's now led to the Ukrainians attacking his strategic bomber fleet and wiping out a good proportion of it, and possibly, as we've just heard, launching another attack on the Kerch Bridge. So that was a very, very costly decision by Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. Do you think the truces that have been proposed, do you think that's something that could potentially open up more conversations ahead of the potential conversations in Ankara or in Istanbul at the end of the month?
No, I don't think it makes any difference at all. And all that was agreed in Istanbul yesterday was a routine exchange of prisoners and sadly of corpses as well. Those kinds of arrangements have been made repeatedly over the last 3 years. There was nothing new. So the two sides are still miles apart. And whereas the Ukrainians have been willing to show flexibility and shift their position on various things, the Russians haven't budged an inch, despite all the American diplomacy that we've seen. So I think now the only remaining diplomatic question is, will Trump realize that the Russians are stringing him along? That's blindingly obvious. And will he now allow Congress to pass the punitive sanctions that could possibly force Putin to change his view? It's very notable just how much support there is for those sanctions in both houses of Congress now. As we heard, the Speaker of the House is now in favor of it too. The question is, will Trump say the word and allow those sanctions to pass or not?
And I just wanted to come back to the quote that was shared with the Telegraph from the Russians. Do not put on a show for European tender-hearted aunties who do not have children themselves, when talking about the missing children that have been kidnapped by Russia. What do you make of that sort of language? It's extremely far from anything we can imagine in diplomatic talks. What do you make of it?
It's utterly callous, and it just shows that they're not taking this process seriously, because if they were taking it seriously, then releasing kidnapped children is a classic example of a confidence-building measure that could pave the way for progress. But the fact that they're just contemptuously dismissing all this shows just how intransigent they are.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Roland, do you want to start?
Well. Really, it's more of a question than a thought, as your heart is sinking now. Look, the Ukrainian name for this operation was Operation Pavutina, Operation Spiderweb. I'm just wondering whether we're being a little bit literal with the translation, because I think Operation Cobweb would sound better, but I'm not quite sure whether Ukrainian makes that distinction between spiderweb and cobweb. And of course, spiderweb's typically used to refer to a still in use, clean, young spiderweb, whereas a cobweb is a dusty one. However, it says on Wikipedia that the word cobweb is also used by biologists to describe the tangled three-dimensional web of some spiders in the family Theridae. So any Ukrainian spider experts who would like to cast light on that, could we call it Operation Cobweb rather than Operation Spiderweb? I'd be fascinated to learn the answer.
Just something else from the US, which we watch a lot on Battle Lines in our Friday Trump US edition. There's been some reaction to the Operation Spiderweb that Ukraine launched over the weekend that you guys covered extensively yesterday. And I think it's quite interesting. It shows some of the divides in America that continue to plague the Trump administration in terms of how to support Ukraine. So we've had Steve Bannon, the White House chief strategist during Donald Trump's first term, basically saying that this attack shouldn't have happened without US knowledge. He said on the eve of peace talks or ceasefire talks, he takes the Japanese role in Pearl Harbor, the sneak attack, referring to Zelensky. He's called on the Trump administration to condemn the strikes if it had no warning. Mr. Bannon's no longer in the White House, but he does continue to talk with Trump, and he is quite influential with the wider MAGA base. And another person from that camp, Mike Flynn, who was Trump's first national advisor in 2017, he has also condemned the strikes if they were done without US permission. This wasn't a bold action, it was brash. Ukraine's short-term win could be the world's long-term loss. I think that shows, as I said, some of the divides in America that continue to plague the Trump administration and will be an ongoing issue for Ukraine to try to overcome, with their senior officials meeting with administration figures today in Washington.
Thanks, Venetia. No final thoughts from Dom and Francis. They've had to go, I'm afraid, because apparently there is another raid in Odessa right now and across the whole of Ukraine. So they will be back on the podcast and in London sometimes later this week. David, do you have a final thought for us?
My only final thought is it's astonishing that some people connected with the American administration are complaining about the crippling of one part of Russia's nuclear deterrent. You would have thought they'd be in favour of that kind of thing, but apparently not.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine, the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.